End quote. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to take 3 steps back and get off the asphalt immediately, end quote. I said, and the way she laughed, that high-pitched, shrill sound that belongs to women who've never been told an oppos, no an oppos, in their entire lives, told me everything I needed to know about the next 10 minutes. We were standing in the middle of a quiet cul-de-sac in Oak Creek Estates, a neighborhood that looks like it was designed by a computer program meant to simulate an oppos. Perfect American living and oppos. And Brenda Vance, the HOA president, was pointing a finger at me like she was a judge sentencing a criminal. She was wearing one of those expensive, stiff cardigans, holding a clipboard like it was a holy relic, and she looked at the 2 sheriff's deputies standing between us with this expression of pure, unadulterated entitlement. End quote. His ass fault? End quote. She sneered, looking at the officers as if I were a stray dog that had just wandered in her garden. End quote. Don and oppos. TB ridiculous. Officer, this street is HOA property, and this man is a trespasser who has been harassing our residents for months, so I want him arrested. Right now. End quote. I just stood there, hands tucked into my old Carhartt jacket, feeling the cool autumn breeze against my face, and thinking about my Uncle Silas, the man who left me the house at the end of this road. Silas was a man who believed that property lines were more sacred than church pews, a grizzled old surveyor who spent 40 years staring through a transit lens, and I could almost hear him whispering in my ear right then, telling me to stay calm and let the paperwork do the heavy lifting. My name is Elias Thorne. I'm 52, a retired structural engineer who spent most of his career dealing with city planners and greedy developers. So I knew exactly what kind of game Brenda was playing. When I moved here after Silas passed, I just wanted to fish in the creek and fix up the old porch. But the HOA saw a newcomer and decided I was a target. They started with the oppos, welcome and oppos, letters that were really just invoices for $1,500 in back dues. And when I told them, politely at first, that my property was an oppos, part of their charter because it was built 20 years before the HOA even existed, they didn't oppos. Listen. Brenda and her little oppos, compliance committee oppos, spent months trying to break me, sending fines for the color of my shutters, for the height of my grass, even for the fact that I parked my truck in my own driveway instead of hiding it in the garage. They didn't oppos. Realized that they were messing with a man who had spent 15 years reading the fine print of county zoning laws for fun. So, when the deputy looked at me, his hand resting near his belt, and asked me if I had anything to say before they escorted me off the street, I just reached into my folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, the deed that had been stamped and sealed at the county recorder's office just 48 hours prior. End quote. Before you do anything permanent, officer, end quote. I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat, end quote. You might want to take a look at who actually owns this dirt you're standing on. End quote. The wind caught the edge of the paper as he took it, and I watched Brenda's face, that smug oppos. I've already won oppos, smile, start to freeze, the color draining out of her cheeks like a slow leak in a tire. And in that moment, she realized that she had oppos. Just called the cops on oppos. Difficult. Neighbor oppos. She called them on the person who legally owned the entire road. But to understand how we got to that showdown on the asphalt, you have to understand the kind of place Oak Creek is, or at least the kind of place Brenda wanted it to be. It's one of those subdivisions where every lawn is a specific shade of emerald green, where the mailboxes are all painted oppos, desert sand oppos, and where people look at you sideways if you leave your garage door open for more than 10 minutes. My Uncle Silas's house was the outlier, the old farmhouse at the end of the line that the developer had tried to buy for decades, but Silas held out, and when the HOA formed in the late 90s, he flat out refused to sign their oppos covenant. And oppos. He'd tell me stories about Brenda's father, who was the president back then, trying to bully him into joining, but Silas just sat on his porch with a shotgun and a copy of the original land grant. And they eventually left him alone until he died. And I moved in. I remember the first time I met Brenda. I was out in the yard trying to clear some brush when this white SUV idled at the edge of the cul-de-sac, and she stepped out with that clipboard, looking like she was inspecting a military barracks. She didn't oppos. Say oppos. Hello oppos. Or oppos. Welcome to the neighborhood oppos. She just walked up and told me I had 48 hours to remove the oppos. Unauthorized and oppos. Cedar fence I was building. I tried to be a good neighbor. I really did. I told her I'd check the county maps and that my lot was an excluded parcel, but she just gave me this pitying look, the kind you give a child who doesn't and oppos. T can understand a simple math problem. End quote. Mr. Thorne, end quote. She said, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary sweetness, end quote. Everyone in Oak Creek is part of the family, and families have rules. So either you bring your property into compliance and pay your initiation fees, or we'll be forced to take legal action, end quote. I just watch her drive away, feeling this slow burn anger in my chest. And that's when I went into Silas's old office, a room that smelled like stale tobacco and old blueprints, and started digging through the filing cabinets. Silas hadn't and oppos. He'd just been a surveyor. He'd been a historian of this particular patch of earth, and tucked away in a leather-bound folder was a collection of maps that made my engineer's brain start tingling. See, most people think that when a developer builds a neighborhood, the HOA automatically owns the common areas and the streets. But back in the 80s, the guy who started Oak Creek ran out of money halfway through the second phase. To save on taxes, he deeded the end oppos, right-of-way and oppos, for the main cul-de-sac to Silas in exchange for some surveying work, meaning the HOA didn't end oppos. T owned the road. They just had an oppos, easement and oppos, to use it. And as I kept digging, I found a series of letters from the county tax assessor that were the smoking gun. The HOA had been claiming they owned the road for 20 years to justify charging the neighbors and oppos, maintenance fees and oppos, but they had never actually paid a cent in property taxes on the land itself. The county had been sending notices to a defunct holding company for years, and the end oppos, road parcel and oppos, was sitting in a legal limbo, accumulating a tax lien that was now nearly 30 years old. That's when the plan started to form, not out of malice, but out of a need for survival, because Brenda was ramping up the pressure, sending in oppos, compliance officers and oppos, mostly just her retired husband, Dave, with a digital camera, to sit outside my house at 6 in the morning. They filed A and oppos, notice of violation and oppos, against my truck. They tried to fine me for the end oppos, aesthetic disharmony and oppos, on my vegetable garden, and they even sent a tow truck to try and haul away my guest car because it was parked in oppos on HOA property. And oppos, I had to show the tow truck driver my own survey pins just to get him to leave, and that night, I sat at Silas's desk and realized that if I didn't in oppos, in this now, they would spend the next decade trying to bleed me dry. So I did what Silas would have done. I went to the county tax auction. It wasn't oppos, even a big event, just a small room in the basement of the courthouse with a few guys in suits looking for cheap commercial lots, and went into oppos. Parcel 14B, unimproved right-of-way and oppos. Came up, nobody even blinked. The HOA was so arrogant, so convinced of their own power, that they hadn't end oppos to even check the auction list, even though the notice had been posted in the paper for weeks. I bid the minimum, the back taxes plus a small fee, and for the grand total of about $9,000, I walked out of that building as the legal owner of the very street Brenda used to patrol like a prison warden. I didn't in oppos say a word to anyone for a week. I just waited for the deed to be recorded, and then I went out and bought 4 large professional-grade survey markers and A and oppos, private property and oppos sign. The morning of the showdown, I was out there with a sledgehammer, driving those markers into the edge of the asphalt, right where the HOA's jurisdiction supposedly began. Brenda was on me in 5 minutes, screaming about and oppos, vandalism and oppos, and oppos, destruction of community assets and oppos, and that's when she called the sheriff. She thought she was bringing the hammer down on me. She thought the sight of those cruisers would make me fold and beg for mercy. But as the deputy read that deed, his eyes going wide as he realized the legal nightmare he had just stepped into, the power dynamic in that cul-de-sac shifted so fast you could almost feel the air pressure change. End quote. Mon oppos. Am. End quote. The deputy said, looking at Brenda with a mixture of pity and annoyance. End quote. This deed is legitimate, and it shows that JM Holdings, which I assume is Mr. Thorne here, is the owner of this entire roadbed, including the drainage and the curbs, end quote. Brenda's husband, Dave, stepped forward then, trying to play the in oppos, tough guy and oppos, blustering about how they'd been maintaining the road for years, and that gave them and oppos, prescriptive rights and oppos. But I just looked him in the eye and reminded him that maintenance without a legal title is just a very expensive hobby. End quote. You've been charging the neighbors for and oppos, road maintenance and oppos, that you didn't and oppos, to legally have the right to perform, end quote. I said loud enough for the few neighbors who had wandered onto their porches to hear, end quote. And according to the county records, you've been doing it while avoiding the property taxes, which is a conversation I think the district attorney might be interested in having. End quote. The next few months were a blur of legal filings and panicked board meetings, but the and oppos, Thorn incident and oppos, as the neighbors started calling it, was a crack in the dam that finally broke the HOA's hold on Oak Creek. Once people realized that the board had been lying about owning the infrastructure, they stopped paying their dues, and the and oppos, culture of fear and oppos, Brenda had built started to evaporate. I didn't in oppos. To want to be a dictator, I was in oppos. To gonna put up a toll booth or block people from their houses, I just wanted to be left alone, so I offered the neighborhood a deal. I would deed the road back to the county, not the HOA, so it would become a public street maintained by the tax dollars they were already paying on one condition. The HOA had to dissolve its authority over the original parcels that predated the charter, including mine. Brenda tried to fight it. Of course, she spent thousands of dollars of the HOA's dwindling legal fund trying to sue me for and oppos, bad faith and oppos. But her own board eventually turned on her when they realized they could be held personally liable for the tax fraud. She ended up resigning in disgrace, and the last I heard, she and Dave moved to a condo 3 towns over where, ironically, the HOA is even stricter than hers was. As for me, the neighborhood is a lot quieter now. The mailboxes are starting to be painted different colors, and I finally finished that cedar fence. Sometimes I sit on the porch in Silas's old chair, looking out at the street, my street, and I think about how people get so caught up in the oppos, rules and oppos, of their little kingdoms that they forget the ground beneath their feet, ISN and oppos. T always as solid as they think. But here's the thing that still gets people talking around here, and the reason I'm telling you this. After the HOA dissolved and the road became public, some of the newer neighbors started complaining that the county was in oppos, T-mowing the medians as in oppos, neatly in oppos, as Brenda used to, and there's actually a movement starting up to form a new HOA, and oppos, light and oppos, version they call it. It makes me wonder if people actually crave being told what to do, or if they just can in oppos, T stand the side of a lawn that's half an inch too tall. I did what I had to do to protect my home, but was I right to dismantle the whole system, or did I just leave the gate open for a different kind of chaos? I'd love to hear what you think. Would you have gone to the auction and bought the road, or is there a point where in oppos, standing your ground in oppos, just turns into being the same kind of bully you're fighting? Drop a comment and let me know, because honestly, I'm still not sure if I'm the hero of this story or just the man who blew up the neighborhood peace. Regardless, the fence looks great, and for the first time in 30 years, Silas's house finally feels like it belongs to a Thorn again.